The moment my father-in-law stood up in that conference room and said my husband's name out loud, like he was crowning a king, I already knew. I had known for 3 weeks. But knowing something and watching it happen in front of 37 people are two very different things. I set my coffee down on the table, slowly, because if I didn't do something with my hands, I was going to do something I couldn't take back. Let me back up. I'm a logistics coordinator, or I was, for 22 years, at a freight company that my father-in-law built from 6 trucks and a phone line in a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. When I married into that family at 26, I didn't know the difference between a bill of lading and a packing slip. By 30, I had restructured the entire dispatch system. By 35, I had landed our first federal contract, a regional distribution deal with a government agency that nobody in Ohio had managed to crack. By the time I was 43, I held relationships with procurement officers at 11 different federal agencies. I knew their assistants' names. I knew which ones preferred email and which ones wanted a phone call. I knew their budget cycles, their pain points, their preferred vendors. My father-in-law knew how to sell. That part, I'll give him. He could walk into any room and make people feel like they were the most important person in it. But the machinery of the operation, the contracts, the compliance, the routing software I had spent 4 years customizing from scratch, that was mine. All of it. My husband knew it too. He was the CFO. Numbers, projections, balance sheets. He was good at what he did, and for a long time, we were a team. He ran the money. I ran the operation. His father ran the vision. It worked. What didn't work was the fact that we had been having serious problems for about 2 years. Not the kind you talk about at Thanksgiving, the kind you talk about in a marriage counselor's office, on a Tuesday afternoon, which we were doing until we weren't. We separated 8 months before the conference room moment. I was still living in the house we'd shared in Dublin, Ohio, the suburb, not the country, because we were trying to figure out what we were doing, and because I still ran the company, and because nobody had told me I wasn't supposed to be there anymore. That morning, I drove to the office the same way I had driven to the office for 2 decades. Parked in the same spot. Got the same bad coffee from the same machine in the break room. Sat in the same chair at the same conference table where I had sat through hundreds of quarterly reviews, contract negotiations, and operational planning sessions. My father-in-law walked in at 8:15. He had the look of a man who had already made a decision and was enjoying the fact that nobody else knew it yet. He sat down at the head of the table, thanked everyone for coming, said a few things about the company's growth trajectory, and then paused in that particular way he did when he wanted everyone's full attention. He said it was time for new leadership. He said the company needed someone with fresh energy and a long-term personal stake in its future. He looked at my husband and said he was officially appointing him as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. I was sitting 4 seats to his left. Nobody looked at me. My husband glanced in my direction for exactly 1 second. He didn't say anything. He shook his father's hand, and everyone started clapping, and I picked up my coffee cup again and held it with both hands because that was the only thing I could think to do. The meeting wrapped up in 20 minutes. People filtered out, shaking my husband's hand, congratulating him. I stayed in my seat until the room was almost empty. Then I stood up, walked back to my office, and closed the door behind me. I sat at my desk for about 45 minutes. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry, or not just angry. It was more like the feeling you get when you already knew something was coming, and it still hits you differently than you expected. Like bracing for a punch and finding out the punch is colder than you thought. I opened my laptop. I went to the document I had been quietly building for the past 6 months, ever since it became clear that my marriage was probably ending, and my role in the company might not survive the marriage. It was a simple document. A list. Every federal contract I had originated, negotiated, or maintained in a primary relationship capacity. 11 contracts across 4 agencies. Total annual value, roughly $4.3 million. Every procurement officer I had a direct relationship with. Their names, their direct lines, their preferred communication channels, the last conversation I'd had with each of them, and what was discussed. The routing optimization system I had built in collaboration with a software developer I hired independently. The intellectual property registration I had filed 18 months earlier, just to be safe, because I had a feeling just to be safe was a state of mind I was going to need. I didn't take anything from the office that day that wasn't mine to take. I left my access badge on my desk because I figured someone would ask for it eventually. I left the files in their folders. I left the company laptop on the docking station. I took my personal laptop, my planner, and the small framed photograph of my daughter that I kept on the corner of my desk. I called my attorney from the parking lot. I want to tell you that I was composed and clear-headed and strategic from the very beginning. That would make a better story. The truth is that I sat in my car for about 15 minutes without saying a single word, just watching the snow come down on the parking lot, and then I called my attorney, and when she picked up, I said, "It happened." And she said, "Okay, I'm ready. Talk to me." She had been ready for this conversation for 2 months. Here's what most people don't know about federal contracts. They are not automatically transferable. When a contract is held in the name of a company, the company owns it. But the relationships that maintain those contracts, the human trust, the communication history, the informal understanding between a contractor and a procurement officer, those don't transfer. Those belong to whoever built them. What also matters is continuity. Federal agencies care enormously about continuity. A new point of contact showing up out of nowhere, sending emails with a name nobody recognizes, calling numbers that were never on the original contract. That creates friction. Procurement officers don't like friction. They have enough of it already. I reached out to every one of my contacts in the 2 weeks following my departure. Not to poach anything. Not to say anything negative about the company. I just reached out personally to let them know I was moving on and to introduce the idea that I was consulting independently now. I mentioned, in passing, that the routing system I had developed was mine, and that I would be offering it as a service going forward through my own LLC. Most of them responded within 24 hours. 2 of them asked me very directly whether I would be available to serve as their primary vendor contact under a new arrangement. I said I would have my attorney review the relevant terms and get back to them. My attorney reviewed the relevant terms. I started my LLC in February. I want to tell you about my daughter because this is important. She was 17 at the time, a junior in high school, and she had been watching her parents' marriage fall apart with the particular composure of a kid who had been processing things quietly for a long time and had gotten very good at it. She had my coloring and her father's ability to do mental math, which I always thought was a strange combination. She was on the swim team. She wanted to study environmental science. When I told her I was leaving the company, she was sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework. She didn't look up from her notebook for a moment. Then she said, "Was it your idea or theirs?" I said it was complicated. She said, "But the contracts are yours." I said yes. She said, "Good," and went back to her homework. She knew. Kids always know more than we think they do. The months that followed were not glamorous. I want to be clear about that. I had savings. I had a severance agreement that my attorney negotiated to include a non-disparagement clause that ran in both directions, which meant they couldn't say anything negative about me publicly, and I couldn't say anything negative about them. I had my LLC, and I had my routing software, and I had 11 years of federal contract relationships. But I also had a teenage daughter, a house I was trying to figure out how to keep, a divorce that was still in progress, and the particular exhaustion that comes from having poured 22 years into something and then walking out the door with only what fits in a personal laptop bag. I built the consulting business slowly. I didn't rush it. The first contract came through in March. A smaller agency, regional, nothing like what I was used to managing. But it was mine. Every piece of it was mine. By May, I had 3 clients. One of them was a federal agency I had worked with for 9 years under the previous arrangement. The transition had required some paperwork and some patience. But it happened because the relationship was intact and the routing system worked better than anything else they had tried. By August, I had 5 clients and 1 full-time employee, a woman I had worked with briefly years earlier, who reached out after hearing I had gone independent. She was excellent. We still work together now. I'm going to tell you something that I didn't know for a long time after I left, because no one told me and I wasn't in a position to find out. I heard it eventually, in pieces, through someone who still worked there and felt I deserved to know. Apparently, the first 2 federal agency contacts my husband tried to reach after I left were polite. They responded to his emails, they took his calls, and then, over the following 6 weeks, 2 of those agencies initiated early exit conversations on their contracts. Nothing dramatic. No accusations, no formal complaints. They cited changing procurement priorities and budget reallocations. Standard language. Both contracts were allowed to expire without renewal. A third agency, one of the larger ones, informed the company that they would be conducting a standard vendor review before the next contract cycle, and that the outcome was not guaranteed. My father-in-law called my attorney. My attorney took detailed notes. He didn't say anything threatening or explicit. He was too smart for that. He said he wanted to reach out on a personal basis, to express that he hoped things could be resolved amicably, that the family considered me an asset, that there was perhaps a path forward that could benefit everyone involved. My attorney said she would relay the message. She relayed the message. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about 22 years. I thought about the conference room and the 37 people, and the way my husband had looked at me for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. I thought about my daughter at the kitchen counter saying, "The contracts are yours," like it was the simplest thing in the world. I told my attorney to send my regards and to let him know that I was very happy in my current direction and didn't anticipate any changes. She sent the message. We didn't hear from him again. I want to talk about the routing software for a moment, because I think it matters, and because it's the part of this that I'm most proud of, honestly, more than any contract or any revenue number. I spent 4 years building that system. I had started from frustration, from the experience of managing a fleet across multiple regions with software that had been designed for single location operations and had never been properly adapted. I had hired a developer out of my own budget initially, before the company agreed to fund it, because I needed it to exist, and it didn't exist yet. The intellectual property registration had been a gut instinct. Or maybe it was something I learned from watching my father-in-law long enough to understand that in business, the people who protect themselves quietly are the ones who survive. The system was good. It was genuinely good. By the time I left, it was handling routing optimization for a fleet of nearly 200 vehicles across 7 states. When I licensed it independently through my LLC, I priced it based on what the market would bear, which turned out to be considerably more than I had originally assumed. My former company reached out through a third party 6 months later to inquire about licensing terms. I had my attorney respond. The licensing terms were reasonable and clearly stated. I didn't price them out, I didn't play games, but I also didn't offer a discount. They accepted the terms. I found out later, from the same person who told me about the contracts, that the acceptance was not received enthusiastically. That was not my problem. Here is what I want you to take from this, if you're taking anything. I was not a victim. I want to say that clearly, because I think sometimes these stories get told in a way that positions the person telling them as someone who had everything taken away and then got lucky. That's not what happened. What happened is that I spent 22 years building skills and relationships and systems that belonged to me, that lived in me, and that no one had the ability to remove by standing up in a conference room and announcing a new org chart. When someone takes the title away, they don't take the substance. The substance is portable. I didn't understand that the way I understand it now, but I think some part of me always knew it. The part that filed the IP registration, the part that kept meticulous records, the part that called my attorney from the parking lot before I had even driven out of the lot. Document everything. I know that sounds like something you put on a motivational poster, but I mean it practically. Know what belongs to you. Know the difference between what you built for someone else and what you built for yourself. Understand which relationships are institutional and which ones are personal. That clarity is not something anyone can take from you either. My daughter started college last fall. Environmental science, as she planned. She goes to a school in Vermont, which is about as far from Columbus as you can get while still being in the continental United States, and she is exactly as composed and quietly competent as she has always been, which means she is going to be fine. My LLC has 7 employees now. We manage logistics, consulting, and software licensing for 14 clients across 3 states, 4 of them federal. I drive a different car than I drove when I was parking in that lot every morning, and I drink better coffee. The company is still operating. I know this because the licensing agreement means I occasionally receive correspondence about system updates, and I sign off on compliance documentation. It's a business relationship, nothing more. I am professional and responsive, and I do not particularly enjoy it, and I do not particularly mind it. My father-in-law has not called me since the message my attorney relayed. I don't know what he tells people about what happened. I don't know what version of this story circulates in his version of events. I don't need to. My version is the one that comes with a working company, 7 employees, and a daughter who texts me pictures of her hiking trails in Vermont and occasionally calls to talk about nothing in particular, which is the best kind of call. The room went still that morning, and I set my coffee down, and I watched 37 people look at someone else like he was the answer. What they didn't see was that I had already been writing the next chapter for months.